Hello, welcome to Battle of the Ports and the granddaddy of the first mass-selling video game, Space Invaders by Taito. Now there are so many ports of Space Invaders that it is not possible for me to cover all of them, so the rules are that only official versions will be covered. Apparently no official version made it to most home micros. Also, we're not covering emulated versions or anything released after 1994. Why? Well, from that day onwards, the floodgates opened with 1 billion ports coming out. So on to the history of Space Invaders. Space Invaders was developed by Japanese designer Tomohiro Nishikado, who spent a year designing it and developing the necessary hardware to produce it. The game was a response to Atari's arcade game Breakout from 1976. Nishikado wanted to adapt the same sense of achievement and tension from destroying targets one at a time, combining it with elements of target shooting games. The game uses a similar layout to that of Breakout, but with different game mechanics. Rather than a bouncing ball to attack the static objects, players are given the ability to fire projectiles at moving enemies. Early enemy designs included tanks, combat planes, and battleships. Nishikado, however, was not satisfied with the enemy movements. Technical limitations made it difficult to simulate flying. Humans would have been easier to simulate, but the designer considered shooting them immoral. After seeing the release of the 1974 anime Space Battleship Yamato in Japan, and seeing a magazine feature about Star Wars in 1977, he thought of using a space theme. Nishikado drew inspirations for the aliens from H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, and created initial bitmap images after the octopus-like aliens. Other alien designs were modelled after squids and crabs. Space Invaders was originally titled Space Monsters, after a popular song in Japan at the time, Monster, but was changed to Space Invaders by the designer's superiors, and probably just as well. Richard Maurer was responsible for this official 1980 port released by Atari for the 2600. This was a killer app for Atari, even though it's not arcade perfect. The first thing you'll notice is how different the aliens look, followed by the famous audio is now classic Atari interference white noise. I'm not really a fan of this one as the game plays a little differently. For a start, when the aliens reach the top line of your bases, all the bases suddenly vanish, leaving you with zero protection. Also, the game speeds up not based upon the location of the aliens, but due to how many are left on screen. Still, it is very cool how Richard managed to program this with zero sprite flicker. The Atari 5200 also got an official port. This one was programmed by Eric Mangies. Just like the 2600 version, this speeds up depending how many craft are left on screen rather than how close to the base they are. Also, your bases disappear just like they do on the 2600. I'm not a fan of this one, mainly because of how the aliens scroll onto the screen from the left. In 1985, Sega released their own developed version of Space Invaders for the SG-1000. Now this is more like it. This looks very much like the arcade game, unlike the two Atari versions. We even have the arcade opening where the alien takes the letter Y. This, as you can see and hear, is a very good port. March 1st, 1985 saw an official release by Taito for the MSX. Being that this is an official release, you'd expect it to be better than Sega's official reprogrammed version, but it isn't. The MSX and the SG-1000 are quite similar, yet this version feels sluggish and doesn't quite look as nice. Not that there's much to look at in Space Invaders. The Famicom version, also by Taito, released on April 1st, 1985, and again, is an inferior version compared to the SG-1000 release. This looks pretty stodgy and sounds like a cheap imitation. Again, it seems a little sluggish like the MSX release. March 2nd, 1990 saw Taito release a port to the PC Engine. This port actually does something that no other version has managed to do yet. Can you guess what it is? Well, if you didn't notice, the bullets change colour just as they would have done on the arcade machine as they passed through the colour filter film that gave the arcade version its colour. Sadly, the sound on this port is not right, but to make up for that, it also comes with an updated version of the game called Space Invaders Plus, which is kind of what the Mega Drive Space Invaders 90 is like. We aren't going to show you the game though, because it isn't the original, but it does have a cool intro that I'm sure you'll like. On March 30th, 1990, Taito released a port to the Game Boy. This seems to be based upon the Famicom version, judging by the state of the aliens. Still, it's okay, but not the best version of Space Invaders you'll ever play. Thankfully, there was also a Super Game Boy Enhanced release, which you can see now. This is much better as it gives more screen options, as well as playing better. There's even a mode to upload a version of the game directly to the Super Famicom. (1992) saw a release for NEC's PC-9801 from a company known as Outback. This is an official licensed port and comes with 3 modes. The original monochrome version, which is fine, a modern version which plays just like the original, and the parody, which I can't believe they got away with, has you playing as a guy throwing cans of Pepsi at Coca-Cola branded drinks, being Coke, Sprite and Fanta. Wow! And we'll finish off with this 25th of July 1994 release from Taito for the Super Famicom. This version comes with a nice little 2-player puzzle game, but also contains all 4 versions of the original, being the stand-up cabinet with the painted background, the black and white version, the coloured cellophane version, and the colour version. This is also the only port on this video to feature the correct sound. After this release there were many more, including releases for the WonderSwan, Saturn, PlayStation, and many more, as well as many remakes and special versions, but those will have to wait for another day. And let's take a look at all those versions of Space Invaders running side by side.